Now, as I mentioned, there's been some movement in the US when it comes to recognising the election result and moving on. The crucial state of Michigan has been declared. Now, along with Georgia, that's two states flipping from Trump to Biden that virtually guarantee the result. And that's been enough for a previously obscure public servant, Emily Murphy, who runs what's called General Services Administration in Washington. It's been enough for her to give the green light for Joe Biden's team to begin preparations for a transition to power. This move gives them some government resources, finance and access in order to start that transition, the transition from the Trump administration to a Biden administration. Now, Donald Trump tweeted that Murphy had been steadfast, dedicated and loyal to her country and had been unfairly harassed, threatened and abused while she was delaying this transition. And while Trump vowed to continue his legal fights over voter fraud, claiming he'd still prevail in the election, he announced he was recommending that Emily Murphy and her team do what they need to do with regard to what he called initial protocols. And he's told his team to do the same. Reports today confirm his chief of staff has issued the same instruction internally. Now, this is not a concession of defeat, but this is a first step towards that loser's consent that I said yesterday might be a good Thanksgiving present to the nation this week. Now, getting rid of Donald Trump, I'm not saying that's a gift. For half the country, that'll be a great disappointment. But the ending of this uncertainty might be the gift that the US needs just now. Look, for quite a while, I've wanted to have a broad chat on air with Annalise Nielsen. You've been watching her stuff from the US for months now, and I did catch up with her earlier today. Annalise, it's great to talk to you. I'm sorry we didn't catch up when I was in the States, but you were in Philadelphia and I was driving around and whatnot. Your reports across the last many, many weeks, months have been fantastic. So people keep asking me, what was it like in the States? How would you describe it? I thought, who better to explain that to us than you? Because you've travelled the length and breadth, not just all the political hotspots. You've spoken to so many people in sort of middle America, if you like. What are your impressions of where the country is at just now?
Oh, that's really kind, Chris. Thank you. It's really funny because I came here in mid-August and it was just such an unknown quantity when we came over, just about how it would all work. And even travelling state to state, we had to get all the assurances that media was exempt. And the first time I drove from Illinois to Wisconsin, I felt like my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I was just so terrified about crossing a border. And then about a week in, you just realise that it was just a completely different attitude towards coronavirus here. That especially as soon as you got out of the cities, I went and saw my cousins in the suburbs of Wisconsin, and it was just a whole different world. People weren't wearing masks. It was just, what's this thing? Oh, it's not really a big issue. I have to say, over the last few months, it's been a very weird time in the US, and you can understand why people are so tense and angry. You can really understand that. But what is really just alarming, I think, when we look at the longer term of where America is going, is they're just so divided and people aren't talking. And I think that's going to be the real thing to watch, because unlike what we've seen in the past, I don't feel like America's on the precipice of a civil war or something like that. But I feel like if something happened, it could all escalate much quicker than we've ever seen in history.
Yeah, well, I think people forget about the division and the violence and the dissent in the history of America for 300 years or more. And they forget that there are forces there that are always rallying against the government or against other states or against other communities. So it is a history that's very much part of the country's DNA. But I suppose there's so much there to talk about. You talk about the virus and you talk about the politics, but there's overlap between those two things. And what I noticed, of course, let's start with the virus, is the attitudes were so different from one city to another or one area to another. Can you pinpoint for us which places are more focused on the virus and which are more relaxed about it?
Oh, it's so interesting you say that, because I even found when I'd go to approach someone who I thought would be a Trump supporter, I'd instinctively find myself taking my mask down because they wouldn't talk to me if I was wearing a mask. And it's just become such a political statement in the US, whether you decide to wear one or not. And I haven't seen that in any other country. I have to say, it's probably the further south you go, the less seriously they take it. The further you get out of big cities, the less seriously they take coronavirus. And just the warmer climates as well, if there's more space. Trying to talk to farmers and the like about it, they just don't take it seriously. But I think you're making a really good point there about the history of the US. It does have a violent history, but this coronavirus has really stretched people to their limit in that people are angry that they're not doing what they normally do and they think they should be able to do it, or they're really frustrated that no one's taking these restrictions seriously and they feel like it's impacting them adversely. And so that's a divide which I think is just completely historic. We have not seen, I think, in either of our lifetimes.
Yeah, exactly. A divide over the actual virus and how to approach it. What about the other divisions, the racial divisions and the political divisions? I was struck, especially away from big cities, of course, by how normally people were going on about their lives, how phlegmatic they were. But you've seen much more of the country, and a great aspect of your reporting is, apart from the political players and the political theatre, the theatre of the absurd, you've also spoken to such a broad range of American voices. Do you? What are the key fissures there? Do you see it as Democrat versus Republican, Trump supporters versus Biden supporters, or is it the racial tensions? What is it that worries you most?
I mean, the racial tensions in America are awful. And I mean, when you look at the inequality that African Americans face, that is very recent history. So this is why you can't just expect people to move on and say, oh, well, life's better now. And one of the worst things that they face is the incarceration rates. That's going to be a big challenge for an incoming Biden administration. Now, the really big divisive issue this time around was this idea of defund the police. When you talk to normal suburban voters, they don't want police funding to go down. The idea of having fewer police on the streets, especially at a time like this, terrifies them. But they are also completely aware that there is unequal treatment under the law, and they want that fixed as well. And they don't think that this is a one or the other issue. And I think that's something that the Biden camp communicated much better than Donald Trump, who just focused in really on that law and order aspect, which I found actually played really well in country areas. Farmers were the number one ones telling me about how they were worried about protests and riots in the cities. And it was so far away from anything they'd experienced. But when you have a life that's so set in routine, that's so community-minded, and also you're really far away from a lot of resources when you're out in these rural places, that idea scared them. So I think the number one thing we did was just ask people what actually matters to you. And that was the key thing, was so many people, it just wasn't coronavirus. And that's why this election was much closer than people anticipated. Yeah, well, it's great stuff. Your reporting has been really insightful and we've all benefited from it back here. And the great news is you're going to stay on right through inauguration, which is brilliant. But just before we let you go, what chance do you think Donald Trump could concede this week? Maybe a Thanksgiving present to the nation? I think we've probably got the most of a concession we're possibly going to get out of Donald Trump and him allowing the administrative stuff to go through now. That was actually more than I was expecting, really, up until Inauguration Day. I'll be interested to see if he actually participates in any of the normal ceremony. The really big concern there was that they were going to start really making themselves vulnerable on an international stage. If you don't have a peaceful transition of power, who's running the show? Who's in charge? And I think it was really the Republicans that were putting that pressure on Donald Trump. There's going to be just a fascinating few years watching the Republican Party build themselves, because they are so fractured by the traditional, normal, conservative, Reagan-type Republicans compared to the Trump supporters who've just dominated the last 4 years. I think there's a good chance, even if it's not Donald Trump, there'll be a similar figure to try and fill that vacuum, because his supporters aren't going anywhere. And the really big thing to watch, I think, in the next 4 years is Joe Biden's claiming this big mandate. He got a lot of voters who just didn't like Trump. They weren't voting for him. They were voting to get Trump out. That was the number one thing I heard from Biden supporters. That's not to say he doesn't have a lot of supporters as well. I mean, we saw the popular vote go up on both sides, but this is not going to be an easy run for Joe Biden either. Yeah, he doesn't have much of a mandate at all, really, and he won't have the Senate most likely either. Thanks so much for joining us, Annalise. Really appreciate it. No, thank you for having me on. Great stuff there from Annalise. She's right. Donald Trump, even after he's gone, he will have put some steel into the spine of the Republicans for sure, but they'll have trouble dealing with all of that.